Welcome back, everyone. If you don't have a coffee right now, I highly recommend going to get one because this is the longest video I have ever and will probably ever make. In this video, we are going to cover unit testing, which is so incredibly important to making a stable application. As always, we are going to start super simple, and I mean super simple in this video, and then we're going to work our way up to some more advanced tests. By the end of this, we are going to cover asynchronous tests as well as tests for Combine, which I know a lot of you guys have been asking about. Now, if you are just joining, I first want to welcome you to the channel. It's called Swiftful Thinking. We cover all things Swift, SwiftUI related. You should probably hit subscribe. But secondly, I want to point out that at the end of this, the later tests that we're going to do in this video, we are going to use protocols and dependency injection. And if you do not know what either of those two topics are, I just covered them in the last two videos in this series. So my recommendation is to watch those two videos and then watch this one. And that's the whole reason that I'm doing these videos in a chronological order. But if you watch those, you are definitely more than ready. So in this video, we're going to cover unit testing, and in the next video, we're going to cover UI testing. These are the two types of testing that we have in iOS development. And the simplest way to think about these two types is unit testing is testing all of basically your code, your logic in your app. UI testing is strictly testing the UI components that a user would go through. So if a user opens your phone and they click these buttons, that's UI testing. But if you are trying to test the underlying logic in your view models, your data services, your utilities, all of that actual code that you were creating and you want to make sure it's still working, that's where unit tests come in. And as you're going to see, it does take us a little extra time as developers to write good tests for our code, but in the long term, it is almost always worth it to have really good tests for your code. The reason we write these tests is not just to make sure our code is working today, but to make sure our code is always working in the future. Because you never know if either you or maybe someone else in the future is going to be in the code base changing some code, and maybe they mistakenly commented something out or made something not work. In those scenarios, we would be very happy to have tests, because before we release our app to the App Store, we could run all of our tests and we can make sure all of the logic in our app is actually still functioning and working as expected. All right. And I think that's enough of an introduction, because you guys are about to jump into this video, and it's like 2 hours long now, and you're going to be hearing my voice a whole lot, so I don't want to bore you guys out in the introduction. Again, unit testing is super powerful, and there is just so much to cover, so I apologize for making such a long video, but I think as you guys get into it, you're going to see all the code really does flow together, and by the end of it, you guys are going to be testing experts.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So I am back in our Xcode project as always. And in the last video, we covered dependency injection. In the video before that, we covered protocols. We're going to need to know both of those in order to complete this video. So if you do not understand protocols or dependency injection, I highly recommend watching those and then watching this video. And if you've watched those, you're definitely ready. So we're going to create a couple files in this video. So let's actually create a folder. So I'm going to right click the navigator and create a new group, and let's call it Unit Testing Bootcamp. And inside that folder, I'm going to right click, create a new file. We'll create a SwiftUI view, and let's call it Unit Testing Bootcamp View. Go ahead and click create. Once you're inside, let's click resume and let's get coding. Before we actually get into it, I just want to briefly talk to you guys about testing, because if you've never done any kind of testing in your apps before, it does seem a little illogical, a little anti-pattern, and I'll explain why as we go. So let's create a multi-line comment here, and there are two types of tests. There are unit tests and there are UI tests. Now I'm going to keep this as simple as I can. Unit tests basically test the business logic in your app, while UI tests test the UI of your app. So I'm oversimplifying it here, but if you think about when you're developing your app and you're creating all of your files, the first file you're probably creating is a view, and the view is going to hold all of the buttons and all the things that users are actually going to see and click. All of those UI components will be tested through UI tests. And UI tests will literally test the flow that a user is going to do in your app. So a user is going to open your app, they're going to click this button, they're going to click that button, they're going to type in this text field. That's what we're going to test in here. But unit tests are going to test pretty much everything else in your app and your code other than the UI. So the easy way to think about it for me is pretty much any code that is not a view. So if it's a view model, if it's a data service, if it's a utility, anything that is not UI related will be covered under a unit test. And because unit tests cover pretty much everything except UI, the unit tests are actually significantly more common and probably more important than UI tests. And another reason UI tests are definitely less common than unit tests is because that UI tests are pretty much going to be done even if you don't build out the tests. Because when you're building your app, chances are you're clicking through all the screens, you're clicking the buttons, and you're making sure that it works. And if you're working at a larger company, chances are they're either going to have some beta testers or a QA, a quality assurance team, and in which case those users will also be clicking through your app. So if you have all these people clicking through your app, chances are they're covering everything that's going to be done in a UI test. Now, I'm not saying UI tests are not important. You should definitely include them if you can, but unit tests are significantly more important because in unit tests, we're testing all of that underlying logic. And in writing unit tests, we can also test all of the edge cases of that logic. So for example, if we're downloading data from the internet, we can test if the download is successful, but we can also test if the download fails. And all of the edge cases like that are things that we want to cover when writing our unit tests. Now, it all sounds very complicated, but it's really not that tough once we get into it. So we're going to start with some very, very simple tests and then work our way up to some more difficult ones. In this video, we're only covering unit tests, and in the next video, I'm going to cover UI tests. I'm doing it in separate videos because the way we actually build the tests is quite different. So let's actually start coding now, and I want to create a view model for this view. So down here, let's create a class, and I'm going to call it unit testing bootcamp view model. We'll make it conform to observable object, and we'll open the brackets. In here, I'm going to put a very simple @published var. Let's call it maybe is premium, and it will be of type bool. And let's set the value for this inside the initializer for this view model. So in here, I'm going to create an init, open close parentheses, open the brackets, and then we're going to pass in a value for isPremium into our init, and then we'll set self.isPremium equal to isPremium. All right, and then let's initialize this view model inside our view. So in the view, let's create an @stateObject private var VM for view model, and it will be of type unit testing bootcamp view model. And let's initialize it within the init of the view. So we'll create an init here, open the brackets, and we'll set underscore VM. We're using the underscore here because we're actually setting up this property wrapper. So we're going to set it underscore VM equal to state object, open the brackets, wrapped value, and we're going to put in a unit testing bootcamp view model, open the parentheses, and now we need to pass in our isPremium value. We're going to actually pass that into our view here, so we'll put isPremium of type bool, and we'll just pass that in down here. All right, finally, when we create our preview, we need to add in true or false. Let's just put true for now. And in the body, I'm just going to call vm.isPremium.description. So we should have the word true on the screen. Now again, UI tests are going to test the view. Unit tests are testing all the logic that we have that's not on the UI. So the logic that we have that is not in the UI right now is actually just our view model. we're going to end up writing a lot more logic in this view model. So I'm going to actually make it its own file like we would if this was an actual app. So I'm going to cut this view model here. I'm going to right click the navigator, create a new file. It will be a Swift file. And let's call this unit testing bootcamp view model. And then in here, I'm just going to paste in our view model and import SwiftUI. Let's go back to the view, make sure it still works, click resume. All right, and if you are confused at this point, that probably means that you skipped a bunch of videos in this playlist. So I would highly recommend, if you're confused, to go back, at least 2 videos back, watch my protocols video and watch my dependency injection video, because both of those videos will help you understand what we just did, because we are injecting this is premium value into our view model. And if we go and look at the view model, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to test this view model. I want to test all possible cases of this view model, every single scenario that is possibly ever going to happen in my app. So if we're looking at this, clearly there's going to be one scenario where is premium is true, and we're going to have another scenario where is premium is false. So let's start very simple and create tests literally to check that the is premium value is being set correctly. Now, in order to actually add tests to our project, now when we're creating tests, we need to put them in their own file. And unlike all the other files that we've done in my courses, we can't just right-click the navigator and create a new file. And that's because when we create new files, just regular new files, we are adding them into the target of our app. So if we look and we click on this navigator up here, and we look at the targets, this is going to be your main app target. So all of these files will compile when you actually send your app to the App Store. Now, the difference here is that when we write tests, we're doing it for development purposes. We want to make sure that our app is working before we send it. But once we send it to the App Store, we no longer need any of those testing files, right? Because the users are never going to run the tests. They're never even going to know about the tests. And so for that reason, when we create tests, we actually create a separate target just for the tests. This way, those test files don't get compiled into our actual app. So what I'm going to do is actually click on File here, create New, and we're going to create a new target. Now in here, I can start typing in test, and you can see that there are 2 types of tests, as I discussed before. We have UI tests and unit tests. Let's create a unit testing bundle. I'm going to click next. All right, and then we need to add a name for our tests, and the common methodology is either to just include your app name, which our app right now is called Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning, and then include the word tests after it, or include an underscore and then the word tests. I like to add the underscore just because I think it looks a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to put underscore and then the word tests. Let's make sure the language is Swift. The project is, of course, this project that we are in, and then it's giving us an option to add a target to be tested. So this is going to be our actual app because we're testing the logic that's in our app. So all these files that are in our actual target, and that's why this says our actual app name here. So let's click finish, and you'll see that it's going to create down here a totally separate folder, right? So our first target is here. This is with all of our app code. And then our new target is here, which is all of our test code. All right, so I'm going to open up our test file here. So this will be the first test file that they give you. And as you can see, Apple gives us a little bit of boilerplate code here, which is helpful if you've never done this before. To run through this very quickly, we have 2 tests in this file right now. We have test example and test performance example. This is just Apple showing us that we can write regular tests, and then we can write performance tests as well. Performance tests are definitely less common. In here, we can measure the time of something, so how long something takes to execute or complete. But performance tests are definitely less common. Regular tests look like this. We write the word it's a func. We write the word test, and then we title our test, and then we put some logic in here on what we want to test. Now, if I click this little button up here on the top left of the class, it's going to start running all of the tests inside this file. So if I click this button, it will launch a simulator and it will run this test, and then it will run this test. Alternatively, if instead of clicking the button next to the class, if we click the button next to a specific function, like this function, if we click this button, it will only run this test. So we can do this to run specific tests. We can do this when we're done with our app to make sure all of the tests are passing. The important thing to note here is that if we click this button and we're running all of the tests, in between each of those tests, we're going to run setup with error and tear down with error. So if we want to run logic in between these two tests, that's probably going to do some setup. We can do that in our setup function or our tear down function. I'll show you guys that a little bit later as we get into some more advanced tests. But for now, I actually want to just jump in and start testing this view model. So what I find works best is to create a separate testing file for each actual file in your app. So we have a unit testing bootcamp view model file, and in our testing target, I want to basically mimic that. So in our testing target here, I'm going to right click and create a new file. Let's filter for unit test case class. And then let's name this file. And I'm going to name this the same as the actual file in our app, _tests. So let's do unit testing bootcamp view model _tests. So this will be all the tests for that view model. Let's make sure it's XC test case and the language is Swift. Let's click next and create. And before we actually write our first test, we need to talk a little bit about how we want to name and structure our tests. So up here, let's put a quick comment and let's make this the naming structure. So when we go to actually create a test, we need to give it a name, and we want this name, and we want to do this very methodically so that the name describes exactly what we are trying to test in this app. And we do this so that we know exactly what we're testing, but also so other developers know exactly what this test should test. And the naming structure I'm going to use, first we're going to start every test with the word test. We actually have to do this for the compiler in Xcode. That's why you can see the word test here. If we don't include the word test here, you're not going to get this little button to actually click and run the test. So we need to use the word test first. That's a very common beginner mistake. So we're going to use the word test _, and then we're going to include the unit of work _ followed by the state under test _ followed by the expected behavior. And this looked a little complicated, but it's going to make a lot of sense as we start getting into it. I just want to write it out here. I actually learned this naming structure from a Hacking with Swift textbook, which I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably are well aware of Hacking with Swift. So I want to give Paul Hudson a quick shout out here. If you finish this video and you want to dive even deeper into testing Swift, I highly recommend the Testing Swift textbook from Hacking with Swift. It's only $40 and it covers unit tests, UI tests, test-driven development, and much more. This is definitely the best textbook I've seen on testing Swift. So I could not recommend that enough, and that is where I'm getting this naming structure from. So let's write our first test with this naming structure. So let's delete these fake tests and let's create a func, and we're going to use the word test _. Now the unit of work that we're going to be testing is going to be the view model. So I'm going to put in here the unit testing bootcamp view model _. Then we need the state under test. So this is what inside this view model are we testing? And if we look at the view model again, we're going to be testing this is premium variable here. So I'm going to do _is premium, and then another _, and then expected behavior. So this first test, we're going to test that is premium should be true. Let's open close parentheses and open the brackets. So now that we have our actual test set up, we can write some logic on what the actual test is going to be. And when we write this logic, we also want to do this very methodically. So I'm going to up here create another comment and call this the testing structure. And it's going to be very simple, given, when, then. Again, I learned this in that Hacking with Swift textbook, but this is also something that is very common in testing in general. So taking this structure on how we write our tests, let's come down to our test here, and I'm going to literally write given, when, then. And this is a great habit, I think, when you start writing tests, just to keep everything nice and organized. So inside this function, obviously, we're going to need a reference to the actual view model because we want to actually test this view model. And if I start typing in here, unit testing view model, we'll see that it does not come up. That's because we are in a different target and we actually need to import our app target into this file. So coming up here, I'm going to type @testable. And then we'll type import, and we're going to import our actual app code, which is the Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning. And now that we imported this, we can actually access the code that's inside our regular app. So if I come down to this when here again, I can start typing in unit testing bootcamp view model, and we have it. I'll open the parentheses here, and we have our is premium. So what we want to test in this test is that if we set is premium to true, we want to test that it is actually true once it's set up inside the view model. So first let's do the given. The given is going to be that we're going to pass in the value of true for is premium. So let's say let user is premium of type bool, and we'll set it equal to true. Then we're going to say when we set up our view model, so we'll say let VM, and we'll set it equal to unit testing bootcamp view model. We're going to pass in our user is premium. So given the user is premium, when we create our view model, we then want to test that inside the view model, the value for is premium is actually true. In the then, we want to ensure that VM dot is premium is equal to true. Now in testing, when you're checking a value, it's called an assertion. So I'm going to type xct assert, and then there are all the different assertions that we can use in our tests. And we're going to get through a bunch of these, but the first one right now, we want to assert that the value is true. So I'm going to do xct assert true, and then I'm going to paste in vm.isPremium. So it was that easy to write our first test. So given that the user is premium, when we create this view model, let's make sure that the value for is premium inside the view model is set to true. So if I click this little indicator here to run play, it's going to actually run this test. So I'll click it. It's going to launch a simulator on my computer. We don't actually touch the simulator. The simulator just needs to run the tests. And once this test is complete, we will either see a green check or a red X. So that was it, and we can see that the test successfully passed. We have a green check there. And just to show you guys, if we go into the view model, and let's, just for a second, let's set the is premium value to not is premium, so it is the opposite. And if I go back to our test and I try to run it again, it's going to run the exact same test, but this time it should fail. So we can see exactly which tests are failing with that red X, and we can see that this assertion down here failed. So clearly this is not set up correctly. Now this is where it kind of seems like almost illogical for writing a test this simple, because if we create our view model and we set is premium equal to is premium, obviously we know that this works 100% of the time. So why are we writing tests for it? Well, the big reason here is that it works right now. But if down the road we decide to change some logic in our app, or another developer comes in and tries to change some logic, there's a chance that they might not know about this logic and they might change something that ends up changing this logic. And by having this test, we can just make sure that our view model is always going to be functioning exactly as expected. So again, I'm going to run this now that we fixed it, and our tests should be back to passing. And real quickly, before we start just running through a bunch of tests, the naming structure, another way to think about this that we're going to actually do, at least in this video, is it's basically going to be the test followed by the name of either the struct or class. The state under test will basically be the variable or function within that class. And then the expected behavior will, of course, be the expected value of the expected result of either that function or that variable. And again, you can name your tests and write your tests however you want, but I definitely find that this structure works very well to keep everything nice and organized and neat. So we have our first test here. We are testing that isPremium should be true. Let's copy this and create another test down here. This time, let's test isPremium should be false. Now, user isPremium is going to be false, and we're going to then assert, we're going to xct assert false, and we're going to do vm.isPremium. So this time we're making sure that it's false, not true. As you can see, the little indicator is not there. I'm just going to Command Shift K to clean, and then this will pop up, and let's run this test. It's building, and we will find out if it passes. Yes, test succeeded. All right, and I also want to show you guys now that we have two tests in this file. If we want to run all of the tests in this file, instead of clicking these checks, we can click the one at the class level. So I click this, it's going to run this test, and then it's going to run this test. And we can see both are green right now, which is perfect. All right, so we've written two tests and they're both succeeding, but these were very, very simple tests. And in this first test, we set the value of user's premium to true. In the second one, we set it to false. Now, because this is a bool, this test is totally fine because we know a bool is only ever going to be true or false. But when you start running other tests, imagine this was an integer or a string, there's no way that we would be able to test every single integer and every single string that is possible. So a lot of times when you're writing tests, you don't actually want to give it a specific value, but you want to give it a random value of this type. And this will also make more sense as we go, but let's copy this function, go down here, create a third test. And this one I'm going to call isPremium underscore, and instead of specifically true or false here, let's change this to should be injected value. So in this test, we're going to just check that whatever value we are injecting into the ViewModel, that it is set up correctly. So we don't want to specifically do true or false here. So instead, we're going to do bool.random. So now user's premium could be true, could be false, we don't know. But we do know that whatever the value is, we're going to inject it into the ViewModel, and then the value for isPremium should be equal to user isPremium. So to do that, instead of asserting true or false, we're going to call xct assert, and we're going to do equal. And then here we can put in two expressions that we want to be equal to each other. So obviously we want vm.isPremium to be equal to user isPremium. All right. And now we can run this test, and this should also succeed. And this test is a little bit better than the first two because we are actually blind to what the inputs are, but we do know that it is being set correctly. And now imagine for a second that we didn't have these functions in this file and we only had this function. If we run this test one time, it's either going to test user's premium being true or false. So that's great that we don't know what we're testing, but we know that it's working correctly. But the problem then becomes, what if we only test when user's premium is equal to true and we never test that it's equal to false? And maybe if we set it to false, some problem would happen, but our tests would never actually alert us of that because we're only testing either it's true or it's false. So what a lot of people like to do is instead of just running this bit of code one time, we can loop through it a bunch of times so that hopefully this random will come out to true a bunch of times as well as false a bunch of times. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here. Let's name this one should be injected value underscore stress, because this will be like a stress test. And then I'm going to cut this code and we're going to do let's create a loop here. So we're going to do for x in 0 ... less than 100, open the brackets. So we're going to create a for loop here that's going to loop through 100 times. And every time we do a loop, we're then going to run this test. So we don't actually need this x here, so I'm just going to do an underscore. So if I run this test now, Command-Shift-K to get this to show up. If I run this test now, it's going to run this loop 100 times. So chances are, if we run this line of code 100 times, approximately 50 of those times it will test being true and 50 will be false. So let's run it and we should see that it now still works. But what I want you guys to realize is that this test is a little bit safer than this test, because if we run this test one time and it only tests users premium being true or false, we could run into an edge case. If we run this test a whole bunch of times, like 100 times, chances are we'll cover all of the edge cases for this random function. Obviously 100 is way more than we need because a Boolean is only true or false. So we can just set this maybe equal to like 10 and we'll just run our function and all should be good. All right, and now it's time to add a little bit more code to our view model so we can test a couple other things. So I'm going to jump back to our unit testing bootcamp view model. And in here, let's also create a @published var. Let's call this our data array. And let's make it type array of string. And we'll set it equal to a blank array for now. So we've done this in tons of my courses. It's just a blank data array. We would probably put this data array on the screen. So we are initializing the data array with a blank array. And let's just test that when we initialize the view model, the data array is starting empty. So let's go back to our test file. Let's create a func test underscore unit testing bootcamp view model. Let's test underscore the data array underscore should be empty. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. Let's add our given, our when, our then. Now in this test, we actually don't even have a given. We just have a when. When we initialize a view model, let VM equals unit testing view model, bootcamp view model. And the is premium value, we don't really care about because we're not testing the is premium value in this test. We already tested that up here. So for the value, I'm just going to put bool.random. Doesn't really matter. And then what are we testing? We're testing that the data array is empty. Let's Command-Shift-K to clean and rebuild. And we're going to assert that the data array is empty. So let's do xct assert true. And let's check that the VM dot data array dot is empty. Let's run this test and make sure it works. All right, and we can also put multiple asserts inside a single test. So another way to test if something is empty is to check if there are 0 items inside the array. So we could also do xct assert equal the vm.dataArray.count. We can assert that is equal to 0. So if we run this test, it's going to check both of these are correct. All right, let's jump back to our view model now and add a little bit more code. So let's add a func in this view model. Let's just call it add item, open close parentheses, open the brackets. And when we add an item, we're just going to append a new item to the data array. So let's do item of type string, and we'll call self.dataArray.append the item. Very simple function here. We're keeping it nice and easy as we create this. Now we want to test that when we call add item, the data array is actually getting updated with a new item, and that new item is actually the item that we are adding. Let's jump back to our tests. Let's copy this. Let's create another test. And this time we're gonna test the data array should add items. So the given here, given that we have a view model already set up. So I'll put the view model as the given. When we call vm.addItem, and the compiler is not working here, so I'm just going to, let's press play just to build, because I think that will fix our compiler issues. All right, close that. vm.addItem, and let's add the word maybe hello. So given the view model, when we add item, let's assert that the data array is not empty. So we can keep this xct assert true that data array is not empty with the exclamation point here. We could also do xct assert false, the vm.dataArray.isEmpty. We can also assert that the data array.count is equal to 1. We could also xct assert, let's do some other ones here. We could assert that it's not equal, that vm.dataArray.count is not equal to 0. And we can also assert xct assert greater than. We can assert that vm.dataArray.count is greater than 0. So let's run this. Let's click play here. Hopefully this succeeds. Awesome. And obviously, again, we know this works. But for example, if maybe someone else on our team was working in this view model and they changed some logic in here, for whatever reason, this maybe got commented out. If we go to submit our app and we start running our tests would then start failing, and we would know exactly that something is not working because all of these assertions are now failing. So this is why we add these tests, just to make sure that the code that we have now, although we know it works now, that it will always be working in the future. So I'm going to go back to the view model. Let's put that back in our code here. And I'm not going to run through all of the assertions in this video, but we have xct assert greater than, there's greater than or equal. Let's comment that. And there's also, I think there's less than, and also less than or equal. We're not going to use these in this function, but I just want you guys to know that they're there. Let's run this, make sure it is working again. And let's go back to our view model and add a little bit of logic inside that function. So maybe if we go to add an item and the item is a blank string, so maybe like the user forgot to type something in. If it's a blank string, we don't actually want to append it to the data array. So in here, let's put a quick little guard item.isEmpty, and let's do the exclamation for not. So we're going to make sure the item is not empty, else return. So if the item is empty, if it's a blank string, we're not going to append to the data array. So this now is a scenario that we would want to test this edge case in our tests as well. So if I go back to our unit tests here, if I run hello, it'll work. But if I run with a blank string, it's not going to work. Because we know if it is a blank string, we have that guard statement now. So for an edge case like that, we'll actually create a separate test to specifically test that edge case. So I'm going to undo, put hello back here, and let's copy this function. Let's paste another one down here. This time, let's call vm.addItem. Let's use a blank string, and let's be as explicit as we can here. Data array should not add blank string. So here we're going to test that if we add a blank string, it does not get appended to the data array. So here we basically want to assert that the vm.dataArray.isEmpty. And I'm going to delete all of these other assertions because we don't need them. So let's Command-Shift-K, and let's run this. So now we are testing very specific edge case here that if we pass in a blank string, is the data array still empty because it's not going to append. So now this is a great edge case because if someone was in our app and for some reason they got rid of this guard statement and we go to run our test, it's going to obviously start failing. Right? Cool. Let's go back to our view model. Let's keep that guard statement in there. Let's go back to our tests and let's come back up to this should add items test. Let's run it, make sure it is working right now. And as I discussed before with the Boolean, we can always include, true or false, but it's much better to use random inputs. So for this hello, we can do the word hello, but it's much better to do a random string here. So we could create a function that will generate a random string, or I like to do UUID, open close parentheses, dot string. So this will create a random UUID and then cast it as a string, which will end up just basically being a random string. So now we can run the test and it'll do the same thing. But just to make this test a little bit better, let's actually add a bunch of items and make sure they're all getting appended to the array. So let's do let loop count of type int. Let's set it equal to maybe 10 for now. Let's do let's do for x in 0 dot dot less than loop count, open brackets. So let's loop through this 10 times. And again, we don't need the x here, so I'll do an underscore. And let's call vm.addItem 10 times. And we're going to add 10 random strings. So let's assert that the data array is not empty, sure. Let's assert that false, that the data array is empty. Let's assert equal, the data array.count, not equal to 1, but equal to the loop count. We can assert that is not equal to 0 and that it's greater than 0, that's fine. In my actual app, I wouldn't need all these assertions because they're asserting the same thing basically. I'll probably just include this one to be honest. But we can leave these in here because they're all going to remain true. So if I run this now, we can see that our test is a little bit better because we are testing a bunch of loops. But again, this 10 is an input. What's even better than actually doing this 10 times is doing this a random amount of times. So we can here call int.random, and here let's do 1 dot dot less than maybe 100. So our loop count is going to be somewhere between 1, we want to make sure it loops at least one time, to 100. We don't know how many times it's going to loop. We do want to make sure that however many times we are adding item, that it is going to equal the count of the data array. So our data array count needs to equal whatever the loop count is. So again, let's run this. And now we have a much more sophisticated test here. All right, coming back down, let's make sure this test is succeeding. Cool. And let's add a little bit more logic to our view model. Let's just keep going here. So this unit testing view model, let's create another @published var. Let's call this maybe selected item. It will be of type, let's make it string, let's make it optional, and we'll set it equal to nil to start. And then let's create a function here called select item. And we'll pass in the word item, and we'll pass in an item of type string, and we'll open the brackets. And when we call select item, we're going to first check that the item is within our data array, and then we're going to set selected item equal to that item. So we'll say if let x equals the data array dot first where, and let's do $0 is equal to the item, open brackets. So if we can find this item, so if we can find something in the data array with the same string as this item, then we get this x variable, and then we will call selected item, and we'll set it equal to x. All right, so now there's a bunch of things that we want to test with this very simple bit of code. We first want to test that when we initialize the view model, selected item is equal to nil. Then we want to test that if we select an item that's included in the data array, that selected item does get updated to that item. And we also want to test that if we select an item that is not in the data array, it does not get updated because we would fail this if let, and selected item should not then be set. So let's write a bunch of tests. Go back to our testing file here. I'm going to copy our test here, paste another one. Test unit testing bootcamp view model. This is not going to be the data array, but selected item. And let's do should start as nil. So given nothing, when we initialize a view model, let's do an assertion. So we can assert here vm dot, and my compiler was not working, so I just clicked build real quickly just to run it to the simulator and compile the code. But in here, let's assert that vm dot selected item is equal to nil. And another way to do that, which is even better actually, is xct assert nil. We can assert that vm.selectedItem is equal to nil. Let's run this test. This should pass. All right, now let's test selecting an item. So let's copy this, create another function. Given the view model, when we call vm.selectItem, now we know that we have not added any items to the data array inside this view model yet, right? Because we just initialized it. So no matter what we select in this select item function, it should not update the selected item, right? Because whatever we add to this, it should not pass this if-let statement, and selected item should then never be set. So I'm just going to add in here uuid.string, uuid string. And we can keep the same assertions, that it is equal to nil and that it is equal to nil. So I'm just going to delete this one because we don't really need both of them. We're going to actually test here that the selected item should be nil when selecting invalid item. So when we're selecting a bad item, the value of selected item should then be nil. Let's click play here and hopefully this test passes, which it looks like it did. Let's do another test, and let's paste it down here. And this time, let's test that the selected item should be selected. So this time, let's actually test that it does select correctly. So given the view model, when, let's say, let new item, and we'll set it equal to uuid.string. When, first we need to add the item to that data array, so we'll call vm.addItem, and we'll add the new item. Then we'll call vm.selectItem, and we'll select the new item. So now we know that when we select this item, since it's already in our data array, the vm.selectItem should not be nil. So we can actually do xct assert not nil. So we can do vm.selectedItem. This time we're asserting that it's not nil, so we can delete this assertion. And we can also assert that xct assert equal, and we can also assert that the vm.selectedItem is equal to the name of this new item. So let's run this. This should also work. And I want to point out before going forward that when we start creating these tests, we do need to think about all of the edge cases for these tests. So one edge case that comes to mind, and maybe it came to yours as well, if it did, you're definitely on the right track here, is what if we select an item and then try to select a bad item? Is the value then going to be set to nil correctly? So I'm going to actually copy this, and I'm going to add this into the test up here when we're selecting a bad item. So first we'll select a good item. So let's do select valid item, and then we're going to do select invalid item. So let's run this test now, and this test is actually going to fail because when we selected the item the first time, it updated the value of select item, and then when we called it again, although this string never got set as the selected item, it was already set from this function. So here is where we have an edge case in our app, and this is a perfect example of something that maybe might cause problems down the line. Maybe this will cause a crash. Maybe this will cause weird user functionality. So if we go back to our view model and we look at this code here, if the value of select item is already set, if this is set to something, we're never setting it back to nil again. So really what we want here is if let x equals this, select item, else let's do selected item equal nil. So here we're going to force it back to nil if we select a bad item. Now our code's a little bit better in our view model. We go back to our test, let's run it. And just like magic, we are now becoming experts at writing tests. And this is a great test, but we can make it much better because right now we're only adding one item, we're only selecting one item. We know it is the new item. But what if we added a whole bunch of different items? What if we added 100 items to the array and then we selected a random item? Is it getting selected correctly? So let's actually copy this and write it better. Let's do should be selected. I'll call it underscore stress. And let's create a little loop here. So let's say let loop count of type int, and we'll set it equal to an int.random. Let's do maybe one dot less than, I don't know, 100. Then we'll do for x in 0 dot less than a loop count, open brackets. We do not need this x, I'll put it as an underscore, and let's just add items 100 times. All right, and now in this test, we need to keep track of all of these items that we are added. So let's create some random array here. We'll call var items array of type array of string. And I will set it equal to a blank array. Every time we add an item, let's also locally append the item to this items array. So we'll call items array.append the new item. So this items array should be all the possible values that are going into our view model. And then let's try to select a random item from this items array. So we'll say let random item equal items array dot random. Now this random element returns an optional string because if the array was empty, it would return nothing. But we know it's going to actually return a string. But to get rid of the optional, let's just do otherwise blank string. And then let's select the random item. Finally, I want to assert that the selected item is equal to our random item. So let's now run this test. And this is a much more sophisticated test because we have a random amount of loops. And for however many loops that we are running, we are creating random strings, adding all those random strings. Then we're going to select one of those random strings, and we're making sure that we are selecting one of those random strings. So much better test here than the previous. All right, let's do a couple more advanced examples here. I know this is going to be probably the longest video I've ever created, but there is so much to cover for testing, and I think this stuff is really, really important. So let's jump back to the view model, and let's create another function, func. Let's call it save item. And let's pass in the item that we want to save of type string. And let's add the word throws here, so there's a chance that this function throws an error. So this function will possibly save our item, and if not, it will throw an error. So in here, first let's check that the item is not a blank string. So we'll say guard not item.isEmpty, else open brackets. So if the item is empty, if we're passing in a blank string, let's throw an error. And let's actually create a custom error just for example's sake. So let's create an enum and let's call it data error. Let's make it conform to localized error, open brackets, and we'll just have a case here, no data, why not? So if the item if it's a blank string, let's throw data error dot no data. All right, and if it is a valid item, let's check if we can get this item from the data array like we did up here. So I'm going to copy this bit of code here. If basically we find the item in our data array, then let's save it. And so here I'm just going to print save item here. I'm not going to actually save it anywhere. We're not adding core data or a database to this, but this is where that logic would then go. And let's just print out maybe the X so that error goes away. And of course, we'll do else. So if we can't find the item in our data array, let's throw another error. So let's do case item not found. And here we will then throw data error dot item not found. All right, so there's a bunch of things to test in this function, but the first and foremost is if we pass in an empty string, we should throw the no data error. So let's go back to our tests. I'm going to copy this one. Let's create another func. And let's call this test unit testing bootcamp view model. Let's do save item. And we'll call it should throw error. And then I'm just going to add the name of the error, no data. So given that we have a default view model here, let's delete the when here. And in this example, we can just jump right into the assertions. So we want to assert that when we call that try function, it's throwing us the no data error. So we'll call xct assert, and we can type in error, and we can assert that an expression throws an error. So here we can assert that something throws an error. So we will try to call vm.save items, and my compiler is clearly not working again. So let's just click the play button just to build and compile all the code. And let's do vm.save item. And the item here, let's do UUID. Let's do a random UUID.string. We can get rid of these two assertions. So we're going to assert here that when we call save item with a random string, that it throws us an error. If we look at our view model again, if we put in a random string here, this will pass, but we don't have that random string in our data array, so we should throw item not found. Let's go back and let's run it. Let's assert that we are throwing an error here, and we'll see if we are. Awesome. Test succeeded. We can also here xct assert throws error, and we'll use the second completion here. So we will assert, and let's put in our assertion here, our try. The message, and if we hold the option and click on this assertion throws error, we can see that the message is an optional description of a failure. So we'll just put here should throw item not found error. And then we have an error handler here where we can click enter, and we can actually get the error that is being thrown. So this is awesome because we can then check that the error being thrown is the correct error. So let's say let returned error equal the error as, and let's call unit testing bootcamp view model dot data error. So let's try to cast this regular error as a data error, and then we will xct assert equal the returned error is equal to the unit testing bootcamp view model dot data error dot item not found. And the name of this function should actually be item not found, because that is the error that we are throwing here. So now we are not only checking that it is throwing an error, but we're checking that it's throwing the correct error. Let's run this again. Test succeeded. And real quickly, if I jump to the view model, if I change this so it throws no data, this will be the wrong error. If I come back and press the run the test, this should now fail, and it will tell us exactly in this failure that the type data error dot no data is not equal to data error dot item not found. So we can really dive into tests here and make sure that the exact errors are being thrown. We'll go back to the view model and undo that so we get our item not found again. So run the test, make sure we're back to the green. I love the green. It makes you feel so good once your tests are all green. And just to make this test a little bit better, we should actually add a bit of a when for when we add a bunch of items. So I'm just going to come up here and copy this loop where we are adding a whole bunch of different items and then paste it here. We don't need this items array, so I'm going to delete that. So in this test, let's actually add maybe a whole bunch of different items, and then we will try to save a random item that should not be included in that loop, and it should still work, but our test is a little bit better. So just make this one line here. All right. All right, let's copy this and do another test. And this time let's test throwing the no data error. So same deal, we can add a whole bunch of random items, but this time let's try to save a blank string, because we know that blank string should actually throw the no data error. So we'll do a blank string should throw no data error, and let's make sure we're setting it equal to the no data. Command-Shift-K to clean, and let's press play here. Hopefully this test passes. And because these two tests are very similar, I'm going to change this one just so that we can see another way that we can write these assertions. So in our then section, we can actually just do this try function. So we can do catch. We will try to call vm.saveItem, the blank item, and we will catch and we'll say let error. So we're going to catch the error here. We know this should throw an error, and then we can assert that the error is what we want. So we can cut this bit of code here, the returned error, paste it inside our error, and I will delete this. So another way to do it probably looks a little bit cleaner, but we're testing basically the same thing here. I'm going to run this function, and it is still succeeding. And now we just need to test that when we save a valid item, that it does not throw an error and it actually saves the valid item. So I'm going to copy this first error throwing test here. So this should throw error item not found. And let's come down here and paste it. So let's change this to save item. Let's do should save item. We could also do should not throw error, but I like should save item better. So given the view model, let's do a when here, and let's copy a when from a previous test just because I want to save a little bit of time. So in this should be selected stress test, we selected a random item. So let's use that code. So I'm going to copy the when here, come back down, and paste the when. So we loop random amount of loops. We have an items array for however many loops, create new items, add those items, append those items to our local array here in this test, and then we can select a random item. So instead of calling vm.selectItem, let's do some assertions. And when we save this random item, since it is in the data array, it should not throw an error. So we can actually do xct assert no throw. And then here we can do our try statement. So I'll copy this, paste in here, and the item we're saving, of course, is the random item. And I'm going to delete this, and we don't need this either. So here we can check that it does not throw. So let's run this, and hopefully it does not throw an error. Awesome. The one thing I do want to point out that I did touch on before is though that this random item is calling a random element. And we know that this items array is going to have a bunch of elements, but in theory, maybe someone could change this loop count to like number 0, and maybe for some reason this random element actually returns nothing, and then we have a blank string, and then our test has all these other issues. So it could be an idea of when you call something like this and we have like an optional value, and we can maybe just make sure that this random item is not a blank string. So we could do xct assert false. And we can assert that random item dot is empty. Make sure it's not empty. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better code writing. So I'm going to actually copy that and put that on our other random item as well. Do that here. We know it's never going to actually be empty, but who knows if a year from now some junior developer comes in, starts writing tests, and something starts going crazy. Who knows? All right. And another way to actually write this no throw function is the same thing as this do catch here. So I can copy this do. And instead of this no throw, we could do a do try to save the random item. And then if we get into this block of code here, we know that there is an error. So we don't actually need the error, but if we get into this block of code, we know we need to fail this test. So we could just call xct fail. So if we get into this fail automatically, we don't even need to assert anything, just fail. And we know that this save item should actually save, so it should not fail. Let's run the test one more time. And we are successful. We have a little more advanced tests to run, but before we get into those, I want to scroll way back to the top of this file and take a quick look at the setup with error and tear down with error. All right, so up here, if I click this play button up here at the class level, it is going to run all of the tests in this file, which is a whole lot of tests. And when we made each of those tests, pretty much every single test in this file required us to initialize some sort of view model. Now, the way we did it is fine, and it's probably my preferred way to do a new view model each time. This way we can actually customize the init. But in a lot of these, when we initialize the view model, so like starting here, every single one was initialized the exact same way. We did a bool.random. So this line of code, it wasn't a lot, but if it was a lot, if there was a lot of initializers, it could get annoying to write this for every single test. So what we can actually do is up here at the top, what we can actually do is initialize a view model in this class. In here, let's create a var, and it's going to be a variable because we're going to change it. So let's create a var called the ViewModel, and it will be of type unit testing bootcamp ViewModel, and we'll make it optional because there is a chance that it is nil between our tests. So we have this function set up and we have this function tear down. Setup is called before all of these tests, and tear down is called after all of these tests. So basically, before we set up all of these tests, we can set up a view model. So in here, we can call view model and set it equal to a unit testing, bootcamp view model, and we can do our bool.random here. Since we're setting up this view model before each of our tests, when we go to actually run our tests, we can just use this existing view model. So now let's go down, and I'm not going to use these first ones where we actually pass in a specific init to our view model. Well, let's go down to maybe this one. Data array should not add blank string. So the given here is that we just have a view model. So that's fine, and it obviously works, but let's copy this, let's paste it down here, and let's just add the number 2, so it's like the second version. So the given here is that we have a view model, and we already know that the view model is initialized in this class, so we don't need to initialize a new one. So the VM is just going to be that view model at the top of the class. So here we can do guard let VM equals view model else return. So we know there should always be a view model, but in a possible chance there's not, we should actually just fail this test. So we can call xct fail in right here. So now we don't actually need to initialize all the logic for a new view model every time. We can just use that one at the top of our class. And let's build this test, make sure that this is successful. We got our green test succeeded, and the only thing I do want to point out here is that we are calling setup, and it's going to set up this view model, and it's going to set up this view model here, but we didn't do anything in the tear down yet. So at the end of each of these tests, we can call tear down. So really what we want to do is reset anything we have in our class. So in theory, if we kept this view model alive between all of our tests, we would then end up reusing the same view model for all of our tests. And that could actually throw off a bunch of our tests. Because if we ran one test where we started maybe appending items to the data array, and then we start a second test where the data array is expected to be empty, there's a chance that it's actually not empty because we're reusing the same model from a previous test. So at the end of each test, in our teardown, we actually want to just reset everything. So here, we'll set ViewModel and we'll set it equal to nil. So we're resetting our ViewModel. So we set it to nil, and then setup will be called on the next test, and we'll initialize a new one. If I click this button, we will run all those tests. And I'm not going to go through all those tests and change it to using this ViewModel, but I think you get the point here that if you want to save a little bit of time, or you have some really complex, maybe ViewModel initializers, you could do that at the class level here. We got the green check, everything looks like it's running good. And there's a few more tests that I want to cover because everybody loves Combine and almost every actual app has asynchronous code, and we have not covered that just yet. All right, so let's jump back to our ViewModel here. And before we get into the rest of this, I just want to point out that we're going to use protocols and dependency injection here. And in the dependency injection video, the last video in this series, I went really into detail on why we can't use singletons and why we need to use dependency injection in our apps. And now we're going to actually use that dependency injection technique so that we can actually add tests to those files. So I don't have time to explain all that in this video because this is obviously such a long video already. So I just really want to point out that if you don't know what dependency injection is, pause this video, go watch that one, and come back because I'm going to move a little quickly here. Now, when we create a view model, we're going to want to inject some sort of data service. So up here, I'm going to create a class. Let's create a class and let's call it new mock data service. Open the brackets. We're going to create a mock data service. I'm not going to create one that actually downloads data from the internet because that's not really what we're focused on here. We're just focusing on being able to test a data service, and we're going to use this to basically show you how we can test asynchronous code. So we're going to have a new mock data service class, and it's going to conform to a protocol. So up here, let's add a protocol, and let's call this new data service protocol, open brackets. This mock data service will conform to the new data service protocol. And we're gonna have two very simple functions in here. We're gonna have a func. Let's create a func. Let's call it download items with escaping. Open close parentheses, open the brackets, and this is going to have a completion of type at escaping. And let's open the parentheses, underscore. Let's call it items, and it will be of type array of string. And this will return a void, so we'll just open and close the parentheses here. I've covered escaping and this asynchronous code and these asynchronous code blocks in previous videos. So if you don't know what this is, just go watch my previous video. I think it's in the SwiftUI continued learning playlist. And in this function, let's just simulate like we are downloading data from the internet. So that's going to be done asynchronously. So we'll call a dispatch queue. .main.async after, let's do it after now plus maybe 3 seconds. And then in here, let's just call the completion handler. And we need to pass in, this should be an array of strings because that's what our data array is here. So in our completion handler, we're going to pass in an array of items. So I'm going to actually initialize some items in this data service. We'll say let items of type array of string. And we'll then pass this array into our completion here. This is again just a mock data service. We're not actually downloading from the internet. And this should say self.items. And we're getting a little error here because we have no initializers. Let's initialize this items in our init. And let's just pass in some items of type, and it will be an array of string. We will make it optional in case we just feel lazy. So here we'll set self.items equal to, we'll set it equal to the items that we pass in. Otherwise, if it is nil, we will just set it equal to, and let's just do 1, 2, 3. Why not? All right, and then we will call completion on these items. Again, we are not actually downloading from the internet, but if you were and using the escaping, you would have some line of code here that downloads from some URL, and then you would call your completion handler. So we're going to test. So the test we're going to write is basically the same as if we were actually downloading from the internet. I'm going to create one more func here called download items with combine. So I also want to show you guys how we can do it with combine, open close parentheses, open brackets. And the combine one is actually going to return any publisher. And we don't have access to any publisher because we have to import combine. We'll return any publisher that has a result with an array of string and a possible error. And in here, we are just going to return a just publisher, which again, I went over in the last video. We are just going to publish some output, which will be our items. Here we'll call .erase to any publisher so that we get it to an any publisher. And then the just publisher never fails, and we want this to actually possibly throw an error because realistically, that's what will be in our app. So let's actually add a try map here. Press enter, and this will be published items. And let's actually add a case here that is where it might fail, just so that we can actually test it. So we'll say guard published items.isEmpty else. And we're going to actually use the exclamation point, make sure it's not empty, and else we will throw an error. And we'll just throw URL error, maybe bad server response. We'll just do that for now. And then else, otherwise, let's just return the published items. All right, so now we have our escaping closure and we have our combine closure. Let's make both of these functions part of our protocol. So I'm going to copy this, make it part of our protocol. I'm going to copy this, make it part of our protocol. And the reason I'm doing the protocol is because in our actual app, we'll have a mock data service, which we'll use for development purposes. We'll use it for testing purposes. But then we'll also have a production data service. And our production data service is going to have the actual functions that go to our database and download actual data. But those functions in that production data service are going to be the exact same functions because they're conforming to this protocol. So now that we have this data service and this protocol, let's initialize our ViewModel with this protocol. So I'm going to copy this and come down here. So when we initialize this ViewModel, let's say let data service, and it'll be of type, and it will be of type our new protocol. And when we init the ViewModel, we want to pass in a data service. So I'll put a comma here, pass in a data service. Now, because of this, we're going to have to basically update the init on all of the tests that we just wrote. And I don't want to go through all that. And I don't want to run through all that because it's just a waste of time in this video. So I'm just going to give this a default initializer just for now. So we'll set this equal to the new mock data service with maybe nil. Just for now, we're not going to actually use this because we're going to actually inject one, but I don't want to run through all those errors. And here we'll just set self.dataService equal to the data service. All right, and then in our ViewModel, we want to then download that data from the data service. So here, let's create another func, and let's call the first one download with escaping. And we're going to call data service dot download items with escaping. And we get our completion handler here, and this will be the returned items. And when we get these returned items, let's set self.dataArray equal to the returned items. So let's write a test for this now. So when we call download with escaping, it's going to call this download items with escaping, which if we look at that, it is going to take 3 seconds and then return us an array of items. All right, so when we call this, we basically want to run a test that's going to wait at least 3 seconds, and then we want to make sure that the data array is getting updated with new items. Let's go back to our ViewModel tests here. Let's go to the bottom, and let's create a new function. So I'm going to let's just copy this test, paste it here. So test unit testing bootcamp view model. Let's do the name of that function. So what do we call it? Download with escaping. And let's say should return items. All right, so given that we have a view model, when we call vm.download with escaping, then we can delete these, and we want to make sure, let's do xct assert greater than. We want to make sure that the vm.dataArray.count is greater than 0. So we don't know how many items are going to be returned from our download with escaping, but we want to make sure that we are actually getting items and the data array is incrementing above 0, more than 0. So if I run this test, it's going to fail. And if you're not sure why it failed, I urge you to go look at the code and try to figure out why it failed. Pause the video and go check it out. And come on back. And the reason it failed is because, and as I showed you a couple minutes ago, the code inside that escaping function is asynchronous. It's going to take 3 seconds before it returns. And the code inside this test is synchronous. It's happening immediately. It's not waiting any seconds before asserting. So really what we want to do is wait before we assert. So we can actually call wait, and we can wait for an expectation, and we can give it a timeout, which is how long do we want to wait? What is the maximum amount of time that we want to wait? So first we need an expectation. So up here in our when, let's create an expectation. Let's say let expectation. And we'll set it equal to an xctest expectation. And we'll open the parentheses. And we could give it a description if we want. And we basically use this just to describe exactly what we are waiting for. And we could say here, usually we could just make this a note for like other developers. So we should say, should return items after 3 seconds. We don't really need a description here, but it doesn't hurt. And then we can wait for an array of expectations. So I'll put an array here and just pass in the expectation. And the timeout is how long do we want to wait for this to be fulfilled? Well, we know it's going to happen after 3 seconds, but let's actually just wait maybe a maximum of 5 seconds just to be safe. And then we can call download with escaping and try to assert. So run it again. We're going to see that it is still going to fail. It's going to wait 5 seconds, and then it's going to fail. And that's because the expectation was never fulfilled. We need to write some code to basically check once this download with escaping is done, we can actually call expectation.fulfill. Now, the easiest way that I like to do this now that we have Combine is actually to subscribe to the data array inside our view model. So what I'm going to do is create a subscriber here. Let's call vm.dataArray, and I'm going to use the money sign to subscribe to the publisher. And let's call .sync, and let's press enter here, and this will be the returned items. So here we are going to observe that data array. And anytime items get published to that data array, it'll call sync. So once it calls sync, we can call expectation.fulfill. Now, as you guys know with Combine, we need to store this subscriber somewhere. So let's just store it in the class here. So at the top, I'm gonna create a var cancelables of type, and we'll set it equal to a set of any cancelable, which we don't have access to because we need to import Combine. And let's set it equal to a set of any cancelable, open and close parentheses. And then we will store our subscriber in that cancelables. We'll call .store in cancelables. Now, when you start using these subscribers, you do need to have a good understanding on when they are going to publish. And in a couple videos further in this course, which I have not released yet, I'm going to go much deeper into advanced combine, so that should help you guys out. But for now, if we look at the data array, basically this is going to get published every time values are set here. So at the very init, it's going to publish a blank array as soon as we set values. And then once we download items, we're going to set it up again, and then it's going to publish those new items. So basically we want to make sure that that publish that we're getting is not this initial publish, but actually a second publish. So on this data array, we're going to call .drop first. All right, so we drop the first publish, and then if anything else gets published, we will fulfill our expectation. So let's press play here, and hopefully it will work. It should take about 3 seconds, and then after 3 seconds, we will fulfill the expectation, at which point the wait will be done, and then we can check our assert. This is an intro to how we start working with asynchronous code. I'm going to copy this and paste another function here. This is going to be download with combine, should return items, and we can actually keep the exact same test, except this time instead of download with escaping, we can call download with combine, but we have not set that up yet, sorry. Let's jump to the view model. Let's create another func download with combine. In here, we're going to call data service dot download with combine, and we need to sync this. We have a completion, which I'm not going to worry about in this video. If we wanted to deal with the completion and deal with errors inside this return function here, we can do that. You guys can figure that out on your own time, but this video is so tremendously long, I'm just going to ignore it. This will be our returned items. And then in here, we will set self.dataArray equal to returned items. We need to store this publisher. So at the top here, let's create a var cancelables, set it equal to a set of any cancelable. And let's store this subscriber in cancelables. We should also be good coders here and just make these weak references because they are asynchronous code. So real quick, let's just do a weak self, and we'll do it down here as well. And then self will be optional, a little bit better. And now let's test this download with combine, jump back to our tests, and I'm just going to very simply here call download. Let's recompile our app and call download with combine. Now the combine is a just publisher which publishes immediately, so let's just do should return items after a second, but we can leave the timeout for 5 seconds, and let's run this, make sure it works. And all seems to be working good. There is one thing that we missed though, and it's that when we created this view model, when we created these data services, we tested our view model, but then we forgot to actually test our data service. And all of the actual logic for this download is really happening inside our data service. So really, we should write some quick tests to test the data service as well. So what I'm going to do is actually cut the data service and the protocol. And I'm going to right click our folder here, create a new file. It'll be a Swift file, and let's call it new mock data service. Let's import SwiftUI. Let's import combine. And let's paste in our protocol and our new data service. And I'm making a new file because I want our test files to match up with our actual app files. So the tests for our new mock data service are going to go in their own test file. So let's right click the navigator down here in our testing folder, create a new file. This will be a unit test case class, and we are going to test the new mock data service underscore tests. Click next, click create, and we have a new file here. Let's get rid of these test examples because we know that we don't need them. we need to, at the top, at testable, import our Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning app, and we're going to need to import Combine. Let's create a func, and let's use the same methodology. So we'll call test underscore new mock data service underscore. Let's check it out. Let's first test the init is working correctly so that we set the items up correctly. So coming to our tests, I'm going to call this init that we're testing, and we're going to say set values correctly. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. Let's do our given, our when, and our then. So the when is going to be when we initialize a new mock data service. Let's say let data service. We'll set it equal to a new mock data service with items. Now the given, of course, will be the items, and we want to test, and we're going to want to test here. We're going to want to test passing in nil as this value. We're going to also want to test passing in a blank array. We're going to also want to test passing in a valid array. And so let's start with passing in nil. So up here, I'm going to say let items of type an optional string. We'll set it equal to nil. And items we will pass in. And then let's just xct assert true. And when we initialized our new mock data service, we put in logic so that if we pass in nil here, we actually do append items still. We have our default items. So the test, we want to make sure that if we pass in nil, there are actually still items. So we are going to assert that the data service dot items dot is empty. And let's actually make this false. We're going to assert that it is not empty. So run the test. And it passes. And for time's sake, let's just add in a couple of edge cases here. So let's paste this maybe 2 other times. This time let's do a blank array, and this time let's do a valid array with UUID dot maybe UUID string. Let's just paste maybe 3 of them. This will be items 2, this will be items 3. I'm going to copy and paste the data service. This will be data service 2, data service 3, items 2, items 3. On the second one, let's xct assert true data service dot items dot is empty, because this one's got a blank array. And in the third one, let's assert that there are 3 items. And let's actually make it 2, just so it's a different amount than the actual initializer. So in the third one, let's assert that there are 2 items. So here let's xct assert equal the data service 3.items.count is equal to items3.count. And the this one should be data service 2. Let's build this, and they should all be working. Hopefully we get a green check. Let's run through the rest of this. I'm going to copy this and paste it. This time we're going to do one of the functions. Let's do the download items with escaping. And let's just say does return values. I am not going to go crazy with these tests, but let's do this data service, and let's set it equal to nil because we know we're going to have those default values. So I will delete all of these. I will delete our when here, and as well as our then. And this is going to be when we call data service dot download items with escaping. And here we get our completion handler. This will be returned items. So slightly different than how it looks in the view model, because here we're actually going to deal with this function firsthand. So we have our returned items here. And we know this is going to be asynchronous. So right off the bat, when you get asynchronous code, asynchronous tests, that means we're going to need to wait, and we're going to need to fulfill an expectation. So let's up here, let's say let expectation equal xc test expectation, open and close parentheses. And when we return, obviously we want to fulfill the expectation. So we'll call expectation.fulfill. And then we just want to test that the returned items is the correct returned item. So the returned items that are coming from this function. So if we look at the download with escaping function, the returned items that we should be getting here should be the items from the data service, right? So this items is being returned here. So in here, we then want to check that the returned items is equal to the data service. So we need to hold these returned items somewhere. So we'll create a var items of type array of string, set it equal to a blank array. And then in this closure, we'll set items equal to the returned items. Finally, then let's wait for the expectation. Timeout, let's give it 5 seconds. And then let's assert equal, let's assert that the items.count is equal to our data service.items.count. So run this test. And we are in the green. And we have 2 final tests to run here, so let's do it real quick. Let's copy this. Let's come down here. New mock data service download items with combine, of course, does return values. So this time we want to call data service dot download items with combine. And when we download items with combine, of course, we can call dot sync. And here we also want to test the completion. So we can press enter on the completion. This will be the completion. And we will switch on the completion. We'll have case.finished. Let's break. And case.failure. Let error. And then let's break. I'm going fast here because I've used combine so many times in my tutorials. This will be the returned items. And then we can take this code and put it inside our returned items here. Let's delete our download with escaping. And then of course we need to store this subscriber somewhere. So at the top, we imported combine. Let's create our var cancellables. Set it equal to a set of any cancelable. And while we're here in our teardown, we should probably set cancellables dot remove all, just to remove all the cancellables between each of our tests. And coming down here, let's store the subscriber in our cancellables. And we don't need this error in this test, but what we do need to think about is this test, we are testing that it does return values. So if the completion comes back with a failure, if there's an error in this, we should fail immediately. So instead of breaking here, let's xct fail. And then secondly, we can call items that returned items and then fulfill immediately, but it's probably smarter in Combine to actually fulfill once we get a finished completion. So I'm going to put the fulfill in here. All right, let's run this Combine test, and it's either going to fulfill or fail. We'll find out. Looks like we fulfilled. And then finally, if we look at our data service with our download with Combine, we add a little bit of logic here that if the items was empty, so if it was a blank array, it should throw an error. So let's just test that if it's a blank array, it's going to throw this error. So real quick, coming down here. So really quickly here, let's copy this test. Let's come down here. Let's paste it down here. This time, let's say does fail. And this time we want to pass in, instead of nil, we're going to pass in a blank array. So we know blank arrays should fail. So when do we want to fulfill this expectation? Well, we want to fulfill it on the failure. So let's actually cut this and paste it into the failure. And take the xct fail and put it in our finished. So if our completion finishes without an error, we're going to fail this test because this test should actually throw an error. All right, so let's run this one. Hopefully it works. It looks like we got our green succeeded. And then we can even check that it is throwing the right error. So we can say let error here. And we know the error that should be thrown is a URL error.bad server response. So let's first cast this regular error as a URL error. So let's say let URL error equals error as URL error. And then here we can XCT assert equal the URL error is equal to URL error dot bad server response. So hopefully this assert is true. Looks like we succeeded. And even better than writing this out, we can create a second expectation. So here we can say this will be, here we're expecting that it does throw an error. Then we can create another expectation, let's do expectation 2, that does throw URL error dot bad server response. So the expectation 2, and then we could do something like if URL error is equal to URL error dot bad server response, open brackets. So if it is the correct error, we can call expectation 2 dot fulfill. And then in our expectations, we can wait for the first expectation as well as the second expectation. So if I run this, it's now going to wait for both of the expectations to fulfill, which is awesome. And if we go in here and we try to change this to a different error, let's just do maybe bad URL, we try to run this, the first expectation will succeed because it's still going to throw an error, but the second expectation will not fulfill because it's not bad server response. So we can get a little bit better in our code here. This assert will also fail. So let's actually comment this out, and we can just make this the error as URL error. And let's run this test one more time. And this time, the first expectation to succeed, but the second one is going to fail. And we can see here, asynchronous wait failed, and we can see which of the expectations failed. The one that says does throw URL error.bad server response. So we can see that expectation 2 is the one that failed here. Let's go back and just fix that quickly. Go back bad server response. And I'm gonna come back to my test file and click play at the top. And hopefully all of our tests in this file pass as well. We're looking good. And let's go back to our first file and run all of these tests one more time. And we are looking good. All right, guys, so that was a very long video, probably the longest video I will ever make. But unit testing is so incredibly important. I think it's overlooked by a lot of new developers, but once you start applying for jobs, especially more advanced level jobs, being able to actually write and understand good tests is crucial to creating a stable and scalable app. Now, there's a lot more in this field of unit testing that I did not cover. For example, I did not cover performance testing or test-driven development. But there are a ton of resources out there that do go way more into detail for unit testing. One other thing I do want to point out to you guys real quickly is that when we were testing our view model, we left the data service init as the default value. So inside that view model, we gave the data service a default value of new mock data service. And we know when we pass in nil to that new mock data service, it ends up, this is nil, so it ends up giving us these 3 default values in our array. And that's fine. We were just doing some beginner intro testing. But I want you guys to realize that in this test right now, we're using that default init. So when we call download with Combine, it's passing us those 3 default values every time. And that's fine for this test. But if we wanted to dive deeper and write even better tests, we could actually customize the data service that is being injected into this view model. So for example, we could have written tests a little differently. I'm just going to copy this one and come down here. Let's just call this should return items 2. And I'm going to set the VM equal to a unit bootcamp view model, but let's initialize with a custom data service. So isPremium will still be a bool.random, but here we can actually pass in a data service. So let's say let data service, and we see that the data service needs to conform to new data service protocol. So we'll conform to new data service protocol. We'll set it equal to a new mock data service, and then we can pass in items here. So we can say let items, and we'll set it equal to, maybe let's set this equal to, let's just give it 5 items. We'll do uuid.string, and I'm going to copy and paste that 5 times. We pass in our items to our mock data service, pass in our data service to our view model. And then when we run this test, we can check not only that it fulfills, but that it's fulfilling with these 5 items. So we could create a second expectation, or we could just simply assert xct assert equal that the vm.dataArray.count is equal to our items.count. And I'll run this test, one final test for you guys, and it should succeed. Looks like it did. And here, now you can see the power of the dependency injection, because if we did not inject our data service or our data into all of our initializers, we would not be able to actually test that. So that's why we use protocols and dependency injection. But that is it for this video. I tried to cover all of the most common cases that I actually see and we use in apps. There obviously are always more cases, but I think this was enough to get you guys going. And if you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, leave a like and a comment. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.